Hey guys, welcome to BP the Bible Perspective, part 2 of unpacking 10 questions to atheists. Now, before we continue, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. Now, one of the reasons why I am responding to these 10 questions is, one, I find the questions and answers intriguing. I find them compelling, and I also find them challenging. These questions that were put out by the Atheist Experience, 10 questions atheists can't answer, easily answer. In other words, they are saying we can easily answer these questions. Now, this statement is true depending on what context you want to put it in. So the way you ask a question, and then the way you frame an answer. Okay, both could be used to fit your narrative. My purpose is to listen. In other words, I'm not here to say or to dispute science. And I do realize a lot of Christians do. In other words, my point is, I'm not saying that your scientific evidence is wrong. I do have questions, and I'm going to say that there are a lot of gaps, which he himself is going to admit later in the video, to answering the questions. And then I'm going to also say that I believe their position is like anything but God, right? In other words, the answer to the question is anything but God. But more on that later. I want to just emphasize, I'm not here as a scientist. I'm here as one, if I was in an audience, and in this case, I came across the video on YouTube, and I'm listening to what they have to say. Now, some people might be persuaded by the answers. I'm just listening, and I'm going to say, yeah, but there's some gaps here. There's some gaps. Now, the questions were, the Atheist Experience assembled these kind of like 7 atheists to answer the questions. And the one in the center, Forrest Valkai, is the one we're going to deal with question 5, as he tackles the origins of the universe, in which he's going to say, this is an easy answer. So we will see. Now, what I want to do is first play his response in its entirety, and then come back and unpack the answers. So here we go.
What is the origin of life?
There's a lot that we do and don't know here, so we'll start with what we do know and we'll move on from there. What we do know is that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. Now, at about 4 billion years ago, the Hadean period ended. And in this time, we were in a stage called the Late Heavy Bombardment. The Earth was getting pummeled by rocks from space constantly. The entire surface of the planet was a molten hellscape upon which no life could possibly exist. 4 billion years ago, that time ends. And we know for sure that life started at the very, very latest, like the quickest evidence that we have is around 3.7 to 3.8 billion years ago. So you have about 0.2 billion years, 200 million years after the Earth cools down and stops getting pummeled by space rocks all the time to when life starts. That's remarkably quick. 200 million years might sound like a really long time to you or I, but in geological time, that is a blink of an eye. That's nothing. So life starting in that relatively very small amount of time at least indicates a little bit that it's somewhat easy to do. Now, that might lead some people to ask, well, why don't we see new life starting all the time today? A couple of things about that. Number one, if new life were to start, it would be very, very simple and very, very small. So it would be very difficult for us to tell where and when to check for that happening. It's not like we would just see a new giraffe pop into existence. That's not how that would work. And also, if life were to start today, it would necessarily have to start in an environment that is super nutrient dense and like perfect prime living conditions for even the most basic living things. That type of area would immediately get swarmed by bacteria. new life would not be able to start because existing life would take over it. But that's neither here nor there. That's a complete aside. Back to what we do know about the origin of life. What you need to understand is that all life is made of four basic things. There are four major macromolecules that make up every single living thing. And those are proteins, which are made of amino acids, lipids, which are made of fatty acids, carbohydrates, which are made of sugars, and nucleic acids, which are made of nitrogenous bases. There's a few more parts to those things, but those are the most important parts. That's all we're going to talk about today. We can get into the details later. And there have been plenty of experiments in chemical evolution showing that simple inorganic molecules can form these complex organic molecules here on Earth. And those experiments are often criticized by creationists, saying that somebody's fudging the numbers or tweaking the knobs or contaminating the vials. But the nail in the coffin here is that we have found all of those things in space too. Space where there notoriously isn't anybody fudging the numbers or tweaking the knobs or contaminating the vials. If we find sugars and amino acids and fatty acids and nitrogenous bases out on asteroids and meteors and in meteorites that crash on Earth, it isn't because some scientist accidentally messed something up and put them there. It's because those things self-assembled right out there in space. So we have a tremendous amount of evidence showing that the building blocks of life self-assemble in both laboratory and natural settings under remarkably mundane conditions. And when you compound that knowledge with the knowledge that I just brought up earlier, that life got started here very, very quickly, it kind of becomes a lot more difficult to say that life starting on its own is impossible. All of the building blocks can self-assemble, and it started here really, really quickly with all of the building blocks already here. They would have been, the processes that we know create them were already going on right here. So even though there are some parts that we don't know, that doesn't mean we don't know anything. And that's really important, because if you were to boil down everything that we know about abiogenesis to like 10 rhetorical steps, we would know steps 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 10. And there's a lot of creationists out there that like to pretend that not knowing step 4 or step 9 is the same thing as just not knowing anything. And that simply doesn't make any sense. Abiogenesis is a burgeoning field of biology. Astrobiologists are working very, very hard every single day to try to figure this out. And we've made huge strides over the past couple of decades. So again, if you think that this is a hard-hitting argument, that we don't know where life comes from, I have two challenges for you. Number one, what would you have said with this argument just 20 years ago when we didn't know for sure where nitrogenous bases came from or how they self-assemble, when we didn't have half of the evidence that we have today, when we didn't have, say, steps 5 or step 3? Would you have used the same argument then? And how would that argument have changed now when we have those gaps filled in? And then also, what will you say in 20 more years when the gaps that we have now are filled in as well? Because what this God of the gaps argument inevitably boils down to is you don't know how this works, therefore God, or we do know how this works and it's all too intricate, therefore God. And that simply isn't good enough for me.
Okay, I'm going to take his point. There's a lot of stuff that he said that's not good enough for me as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with his last statements first and then backtrack and start with number 1. Okay, so here we go.
And that's really important, because if you were to boil down everything that we know about abiogenesis to like 10 rhetorical steps, we would know steps 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 10. And there's a lot of creationists out there that like to pretend that not knowing step 4 or step 9 is the same thing as just not knowing anything. And
well, there's a problem there to me. So he says, if you break it down to 10 steps, so then you say 1, 2, 3, skip 4, and then 5, 6, skip 7. I may understand the latter because as science goes, you're still investigating, accumulating knowledge. Okay. But to me, step 4 is pretty significant, because what exactly are you skipping? How important is step 4? To me, there's some information here that might need, and I'm going to break it down to show you why as we go back. But I'm going to say I could understand if he said, well, we got 5 of them so far that we understand, but then you're going to admit that you don't have 4. Now, I'm not saying you don't know anything, but what I am going to say is that step 4 could be extremely important to understand. Okay? All right.
That simply doesn't make any sense. Abiogenesis is a burgeoning field of biology. Astrobiologists are working very, very hard every single day to try to figure this out, and we've made huge strides over the past couple of decades. So again, if you think that this is a hard-hitting argument, that we don't know where life comes from, I have 2 challenges for you. Number 1, what would you have said with this argument just 20 years ago when we didn't know for sure where nitrogenous bases came from or how they self-assemble, when we didn't have half of the evidence that we have today, when we didn't have, say, steps 5 or step 3?
Okay, so again, he's making a lot of gaps in his steps right here, and that's my point. Now, again, I do acknowledge that there are Christians that will kind of discount science as ungodly or something like that, or non-Christian. I'm not doing that. But what I am saying is that the very fact that you said we may not have step 4 without explaining how important is step 4. Okay? So that's the argument for me in the past.
Would you have used the same argument then? And how would that argument have changed now when we have those gaps filled in? And then also, what will you say in 20 more years when the gaps that we have now are filled in as well? Because what this God of the gaps argument inevitably boils down to is you don't know how this works, therefore God, or we do know how this works and it's all too intricate, therefore God. And that simply isn't good enough for me.
Well, I'm going to say that, again, if you fill the gaps in, and I'm going to say, for the sake of the argument, gap 4 is extremely important. And you'll see why I say that. That gap 4 is extremely important that you have to fill in. So if you fill it in, I'll say, okay, that's satisfactory. I don't think you're going to fill it in. I think your position is anything but God, as we're going to see later. So let's go back to the beginning and unpack his, as he starts answering the question.
Origin of life.
There's a lot that we do and don't know here. So we'll start with what we do know and we'll move on from there. What we do know is that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. Now, at about 4 billion years ago, the Hadean period ended. And in this time, we were in a stage called the Late Heavy Bombardment. The Earth was getting pummeled by rocks from space constantly. The entire surface of the planet was a molten hellscape upon which no life could possibly exist. 4 billion years.
Okay, so here's my questions then. Here's my questions. So let's kind of go back to what he's talking about here, the beginning of the universe. Now, so here to me where the gaps are going to come in at. If you start the universe with the Big Bang, this is your starting point. Now, believe it or not, there are other, and I listen to, again, astronomers, like I do, that they're already kind of talking about multiple universes. Okay. But if we start with nothing, now let's just understand this. We start with nothing. Now, one of the atheists that's going to answer a question is going to say, well, maybe not nothing, but maybe that the universe or the elements of the universe always existed. Now, I'm gonna answer this now, but I'm gonna also just kind of deal with it further when we get to him. In order to say that, then again, this is the point where anything but God. If you say that the universe or the elements of the universe always existed, because you're not talking about this universe that always existed, right? You're not talking about that. You are talking about the Big Bang explosion. So to the um, left of your screen here, right? So let's start with the explosion. Now, so before the explosion, what went on? And of course, I'm not expecting an answer. But if you say nothing, then of course you have a bigger problem with saying then if nothing was there, then where did the elements come from? I still say you're going to have problems with, even if you reduce the universe to the very elements of the universe. So that at some point then, if you say that those elements always existed, so now before the explosion, and remember we're talking about time existing only in the universe, in the spirit of the universe here. We don't know if that time exists outside the universe. I would say God exists outside of the universe because he created it. Okay. But if you say then that before the explosion, the Big Bang explosion, before that the only thing that existed was the elements. So how long did they exist, right? How long did they exist? How do you measure that? But how long did they exist? So after all of this time of nothingness existing, or the elements, something sparked the explosion. Okay, so something explodes, right? Now, again, I'm way down here just watching YouTube videos, right? If I get a chance, yeah, I would sit in front of a Neil deGrasse Tyson lecture, right? And I'm sitting there, the person is just listening. No education. But, so now, but what, so you go back to everything that we know about explosions. Everything that we know about explosions. And so my question is there an explosion that has produced order, life, assembly, okay, or assembled something? Question. Is there an explosion? Because most of what we know about explosions, they destroy. So if you turn your gas on, most modern stoves have an igniter, right? This tick, 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 tick. It's a sparking. Some have pilot. And we know that if the gas doesn't ignite immediately, you get a little poof. Well, actually, that's an explosion because you ignited the gas. Now, the longer that gas, or the more that gas seeps and fills the air, the greater the explosion. I've been seeing in the news where entire homes, large homes, were completely destroyed by gas explosion, right? But then, of course, you can just multiply dynamite, bombs. For example, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in Japan, the atom bomb, right? That that leveled, right? That produced destructions on an imaginable level. Now, just think, of course, with the Big Bang, which would have had a greater impact, right? Way beyond the atom bomb explosion. Okay, so here we go. So now, in every case, it always leveled destruction. No life, no assemble, just destruction. So now he comes along, excuse me, and he's going to say that this explosion here produced, and we're gonna 14 billion years ago this explosion happened. So now we're gonna kind of come down to just 4 billion, rounding off 4 billion lifetime, 4 billion, to where now we have this happening, right? We have this happening. And he says, whatever period he called it, okay, where there was a ball, a rock, but a ball in a circle. And that's this rock that was the product of an explosion And so now you got, right, the billions of years of this rock, lifeless rock, as he called it. Here's the gap, okay? Yeah, well, somewhat of a 10 billion year gap where this ball is now being pummeled by the rock chunk. Now, look at the rocks that's hitting the earth, right? The meteors, right? They're different forms. They're not all circular, right? They're chunks, okay? But they're pummeling the earth, he says. Just pummel, right? And so now he says, so you give it 200 million years. And all of a sudden, this stops. You go so far, and all of a sudden, this pummeling stops. The ball cools down from the molten, right? Because you would have to have that, right? So from the explosion, this ball would stop. Why would it produce a ball of molten? But at any rate, molten, right? And then it cools down, and it's pummeled by space rock, pummeled. And then he says, all of a sudden, it stops. The space rocks stop pummeling the Earth. Why? Where did they go? For the last 4 billion years, where have they been? So they stopped long enough to now produce Earth. Okay, so they produce Earth, a round ball full of life. Not only Earth, but a solar system. Now, were these rocks just picking on Earth, or were they hitting all of these planets, right? And all of these planets and as the Earth was going around the sun at the time, were these rocks hitting the sun, maybe burning up before they hit the sun, but okay. So now as the Earth, this ball of rock is circling around, and these rocks are plummeting it. And so did they plummet it and then go around, plummet, go around, or were they hitting the Earth from all sides? And then, of course, you have to be able to explain that. That's a gap that you have to explain that. And why? So then at this point, then the rocks stop, and during this 200 million year period of time, Earth forms. Life forms. Now, I'll come back to this picture, but this just to know that we go from this cooling down to this lifeless rock to this. And then he says, this is easy and fairly easy to do. He doesn't explain how easy this is. But let's go on. Did I finish with one? No, let's go to 3.
200 million years might sound like a really long time to you or I, but in geological time, that is a blink of an eye. That's nothing. So life starting in that relatively very small amount of time at least indicates a little bit that it's somewhat easy to do. Now,
how in the heck is all of that easy to do? Now, I showed you. Lifeless rock, this beautiful planet. Okay.
Now, that might lead some people to ask, well, why don't we see new life starting all the time today? A couple of things about that. Number one, if new life were to start, it would be very, very simple and very, very small. So it would be very difficult for us to tell where and when to check for that happening. It's not like we would just see a new giraffe pop into existence. That's not how that would work. And also, if life were to start today, it would necessarily have to start in an environment that is super nutrient dense and like perfect prime living conditions for even the most basic living things.
Okay, so I have a question then. How does that, why do you need to have that? We just saw a picture of a lifeless planet and life form there. Complex life within 200 million years. So why wouldn't life form? And then he says it would have to have super nutrients and really?
that type of area would immediately get swarmed by bacteria. New life would not be able to start because existing life would take over it. But that
Why? I mean, again, if you tell me, that you can start with this and life forms, you start with this, life forms, and then within a 200 million year time, you get to this, right? Am I misunderstanding what he's saying right here? So now, why does new life have to have a more nutrient-rich environment when life started from lifeless rock here? In other words, you start, now you can already explain why this can happen, which to me is going to be even more complicated because, again, you start with this and you end up with this, right? Okay, so let's do 4. Here we go.
what you need to understand is that all life is made of 4 basic things. There are 4 major macromolecules that make up every single living thing. And those are proteins, which are made of amino acids, lipids, which are made of fatty acids, carbohydrates, which are made of sugars, and nucleic acids, which are made of nitrogenous bases. There's a few more parts to those things, but those are the most important parts. That's all we're going to talk about today. We can get into the details later. And there have been plenty of experiments in chemical evolution showing that simple inorganic molecules can form these complex organic molecules here on Earth. And those experiments are often criticized by creationists, saying that somebody's fudging the numbers or tweaking the knobs or contaminating the vials. But the nail in the coffin.
Now, I'm going to say that one of the problems is, here's where you get into crafting answers here. Now, while certainly there are people, Christians, who deny science, okay, but he's not answering the question to me. In other words, when you say that the 4 elements of life, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, are the building blocks of life. I'm going to get to this later, but if you say that these form all of the complex life, this is not what he's not answering. He's saying, well, people are just disagreeing with the data. Okay, so what? They disagree with the data, but you're not explaining, as he's getting ready to make some bold claims of these 4 elements, I guess in a sense creating this complex life.
Often here is that we have found all of those things in space too. Space where there notoriously isn't anybody fudging the numbers or tweaking the knobs or contaminating the vials.
Now, let me play advocate for a moment, because on the one hand, from my perspective, I don't disagree with your data, because what do I know what's going on in space, right? You say they found it in space. Well, they say they found it in space, right? And if I want to be comical, and this is being comical, haven't skeptics claimed that the moon landing was fake? Now, I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson's takedown of that argument right there. But what I'm saying is, I can't disagree with the data. Okay, but I think there's something very interesting about what he's saying here, and I want you to kind of follow that, because we're going to address that in a moment. But so okay, yeah, you found it there, and I'm going to also say that I'm not surprised that you can find any of the 4 basic elements of life, or any of the elements throughout the universe. In other words, if you travel all the way from one end of the universe to the other, I think you can find the very basic elements of life everywhere, because in my opinion, I believe God created them there. So for example, have you not found water on Saturn, water on Jupiter, like that? So the fact that we can find the elements in every part of the universe is not surprising to me.
We find sugars and amino acids and fatty acids and nitrogenous bases out on asteroids and meteors and in meteorites that crash on Earth. It isn't because some scientist accidentally messed something up and put them there. It's because those things self-assembled right out there in space.
Now, log that. Self-assemble. I'm going to deal with that.
We have a tremendous amount of evidence showing that the building blocks of life self-assemble in both laboratory and natural settings under remarkably mundane conditions. And
earthly conditions, okay? Earthly conditions.
You compound that knowledge with the knowledge that I just brought up earlier, that life got started here very, very quickly. It kind of becomes a lot more difficult to say that life starting on its own is impossible.
I'm going to exactly say that life starting on its own, I'm going to say it's going to be impossible, but I'll let him finish.
All of the building blocks can self-assemble, and it started here really, really quickly with all of the building blocks already here. They would have been, the processes that we know create them were already going on right here. So even though there are some parts that we don't know, that doesn't mean we don't know anything. And that's really important. Because
okay, so here's I want to kind of break this down, especially the part of self-assemble. So he claims that the 4 building blocks, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, sorry for butchering that name, are the building blocks and thus self-assemble. He doesn't explain how, he doesn't even explain what that even means, but how do they self-assemble? So this is what I mean by this. If you tell me, okay, if you tell me, where's my picture at here? Where you at? The building blocks of life, where are they at? Oh, great. Verse 4. All right, here I go. Now, I'm looking at a picture of the building blocks Legos, right? It's one thing to say, here is a box or bag of Legos, right? These are the building blocks of building Lego, right? So in the case here, a Lego configuration of a man on a tractor, or look like a tractor or a car, okay? But, right? So in other words, there it is. So you got the building blocks on the left, and then the creation of the Legos, the assembling of the Legos on the right. So the logic is, can you say that the Legos would self-assemble that? Would you say that? Okay, let's move on, because I understand that you can say, well, they're inanimate object, but the logic of them self-assembling. But look at this picture here of the mammals versus the marine life. Now, the building blocks that start from a lifeless rock that produce this life, billions of species, okay? So my thing is that here's where the gaps come in at, and which he doesn't explain. How do you assemble this? Let's simplify it. So if you have this picture, this human, male or female, how do the building blocks, how do you get here from self-assembling? And then why would you have self-assembly like this? So for example, okay, think about the male, that the building blocks or evolution decided, we're going to make a man, we're going to give him eyes, a nose, right? Mouth, tongue, 5 senses, right? 5 senses: sight, smell, taste, feeling. We're going to give him, okay, so remember, he had to come out of the ground here, right? So he had to come out of the ground. So even when we go back to this, how did the building blocks self-assemble, or evolution self-assemble marine life, right? You go back to the goob and all of these particular building blocks of life, excuse me, that you found on out in space, the building blocks that you found out in space, how did they then self-assemble to life here, functioning life? Then billions of life forms within the ocean. Then at some point within the 4 billion years ago, they decided to crawl out of the water and form to natural breathing. So how did they do that, right? Because there's a gap right here that you got to sit up and say that in order to live on the surface of the planet, there's a difference in living in the water, right? Marine life, they have different ways that they breathe, different organs like that. But then mammals have a different breathing, right? And so now you have to form that. So now you have to, here's the gap, and then the gap and anything but God. So now you got to say that the evolution decided it was going to form a male with heart, right, circulatory, breathing, lungs, right? But also, it also said, oh, wait a minute, stop. So before we get to that, we also have to form some food for them. So they have to form some air they can breathe. Then we got to say we have to be able to form these creatures to be able to breathe the air, right? Okay. He said this is easy to do, by the way, simple and in a very quick form. Okay, so then you go in the mix that, okay, so here's this man, right, he has to eat food. So now on the land, it said all this food you can eat. This is food that you can eat. You can't eat concrete. You can't eat rocks, right? There were rocks. The earth was made of rocks. You can't eat rocks, but you can eat food that we formed. We evolute, right? We formed in the evolutionary process, and so now man can eat that. Oh, he has to have some way to get rid of the food that he puts in his body. So now it produces a digestive system where the food goes through, and then we got to put a little anus back there so he can poop it out. Now on the other side, how's he going to reproduce himself? You got to make him an organ, right? So now let's go to the other one that he species. So throughout kind of species, we have this male and female species with male organs, female organs. Thank God, evolution like that, really like that. And then you say, okay, so with the woman, however, it says, I'm going to form you different, self-assemble you different than the man. You are going to receive the man. You are going to now produce a whole bunch of eggs that's going to produce babies inside of you. You're going to carry these babies for 9 months, and then naturally you're going to just give birth to them. I'm doing all of that, right? Anybody but God. But I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to say, okay, you know what? The breast and the milk and all that kind of stuff, right? Male and female. Did you see that throughout all of kind of the mammal life, and also the mammal life and other life, right? Mammals, humans, okay? So that's a lot of gaps. Remember, gaps 5. And I want to go with one more thing here, because I think this is very important, because he's saying that this is easy to do. That we can go from this, an explosion, and then you say we cool down from molten explosion to a rock that's pummeled, that a ball. Why are they all balls, by the way? Just spherical balls, just, to this as it orbits this. So my question also is, if the 4 basic elements of life, protein, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic nitroclasic acids, okay, sorry for if they all exist in space. So if they all exist in space, why don't we have, as we these lives are, as they are out in space, deposited upon, like for example, we just got 8 planets right there, or 7. So like for example, we know that there's water on Jupiter, we know that there's water on Saturn. Why don't we have then the life form if they start over there? Not expecting an answer. What I'm saying is that why is Earth then is the only one, and of course throughout the universe, which we can I expect to see that there is life on in every area of the known universe, right? Where if you go through whatever area of the universe, these I would expect to see that these 4 basic principles of life are there. And yet, when we look at our big um, telescopes, that the only thing that we find life is right here in this Milky Way, among this 3rd planet from the sun, that blue ball with life, billions of species of life. That he said that is easy to do. Now, that is my response, my question. Why do we have all of these life here? And then, of course, we come down to just the complexity of life that he says it's easy to form. That he never explains how do they self-assemble to this. Right? I mean, think about it. To this, all of the that goes into life when you start from the Big Bang, and all of the various species and the different variations of species. He says it's easy, but he never explains how easy it is, right? How easy it is. Now, I'll say this, that Legos are easy because I could take those Legos and I can make a guy with a tractor, I can make a building, I can make a house, I can make an airplane with Legos. And he's saying that the 4 basic elements of life, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, right, are easy to form. Easy, he says. I think they're not. Alright guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. I will see you in part 3.